Hey there, fellow exiles, and welcome back to another video. It's Void241, and this is going to be my Ignite Ground Slam of Earth-Shaking Elementalist League starter for Path of Exile 3.27. Now, it has been a while since my last video. I've just been really busy IRL, so it is nice to be back, and it's nice to be back making content. Now, this build I have been testing over the last week or so has been absolutely amazing. Well, it's actually only been about 4 days, but it's been really, really good, and I've been having a good time, so we'll start off with a showcase of basically, this is going to be somewhat of the gear inside my red map setup. It's slightly more scuffed. My gear is actually slightly worse than what is in that setup. Because I have less armor and I have less, I do have less damage than what is in there. However, I did feel the need to at least put together some semblance of the character on an endgame setup, because I did do a whole leveling run where we got all the way to yellow maps on a 4-link, and then I felt the need, because of time pressure, to put together a character really quickly that was already in endgame, so I could see if the character could do the feared and other stuff. And the good news is this character has done the feared. I've basically cleared all the Atlas requirements and everything, and it's been super comfy. I should expect to be able to have this set up by end of day 1 at least, if not by the start of day 2. If I'm going fast. This character is super nice to play. I have thrown in a Legion as well as a Breach into this map, just so you guys can see the clear, unlike some of these more clear heavy requiring mechanics. And while the Legion clear is not necessarily the best, I do think it's quite insane for a slam build to be able to clear Legions this efficiently. You won't necessarily get 100% of the Legion, but usually I've been getting like 70 to 80%. So if you ended up getting the Legion duration mods, I'm sure you could full clear literally every single one. But the more important showcase that I want to show off is Breach. I think Breach is going to be the more important one, just because next league is Breach League. So there's going to be one in every map. And if your build can't do breaches comfortably, then probably not meant to play it in Breach League, right? So here we actually got kind of a bad spawn on this breach. I'm not gonna lie, it's just going into a corner, so I'm not really gonna be able to showcase the clear super well, just because everything is just gonna funnel. And like any build can do this at this point. But hopefully you get a good idea of the amount of AoE that this build has. It's quite nuts. It's very, very comfortable. And the single target at this point, I think on this version, I currently have about 4 mil, is really, really nice, especially for the level of investment, or lack thereof, actually. Very, very good, and I'm quite happy with it. And technically, I should have slightly better stuff, but in standard, it's kind of hard to buy gear. I've just been kind of stuffed crafting my gear with like 2 or 3 essences or a couple of harvestry forges here and there. As you can see, single target damage, very, very good. That was a 16.5 as well. And it's just, the build's just a good time. The playstyle of the build is basic. If you were watching the map, the playstyle of the build is literally you just leap, slam, slam, leap, slam, slam. And that's it. And when you're on single target, your rotation would be the rallying cry. I'll talk more about this once we get to the PoB section. Rallying cry, you slam, and then you can flame surge if the boss is like really, really tanky. And all of that you do with your tincture running. So it would be this, 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 and then you just flame surge. And yeah, that's it. Eventually there will be room to automate some more stuff, like you'll automate the flame surge at the very least. So there is that. But yeah, that's the build. In terms of positives and negatives, so far I've been really enjoying sort of the playstyle has just been really, really comfortable. And the damage has been quite good throughout the entire progression. If I had to put one drawback on the build, it would be that ground slam only goes in one direction. So sometimes you'll have like a mob back that spawns behind you because of Exarch or whatever, because you're going super fast, and you'll just end up having to slam in the other direction. That would probably be like my biggest drawback. And outside of that, the build is slightly squishy, moving up the red maps. So in that progression, because early game you don't have as much attack speed, as you'll see in some of my POBs, I think the white maps version, I run a Debeon Surge. One of the main reasons we move off that axe, even though it is more damage than the axe that I have in the yellow maps version, is just attack speed. Attacking faster makes a huge difference to being able to actually kill things. So That's probably the other thing that I would call a drawback, is your attack speed early on feels a little bit bad, but as you get gear, as you can see, the attack speed becomes quite good. Also, I seem to have bugged out on Einhar and I'm leap slamming in place. But yeah, now that all of that is out of the way, let's get into the POB. Okay, so now that we moved over to the POB, I want to quickly draw attention to the fact that I have a bunch of loadouts inside this POB, and that is basically to ensure that anyone who is following this League Start guide has the smoothest progression possible. So up here inside the POB, I have loadouts for every single act, all the way to Act 10, as well as your first lab. For some reason, my second lab didn't save, and I'm guessing that's because this is labeled as Lab 2. It is. I'm just going to change this real quick. Don't mind me. That should be correct now. There we go. So all of your loadouts inside this POB, as well as your lab swap for when you want to swap to slams, is in here as well. Now, one thing I do also want to draw attention to is that I do put 200 res inside my config. And the reason for this is because this has genuinely happened in the past. People will look at my items with specific resistances, and then they will try to search for those exact items and end up spending way more. Because rare gear is so variable, I'm just sticking it in here so that if you just know that you need resistances, okay, you're gonna have to cap. So remove that, turn off Oriat's End, and check your resistances and make sure that you cap, at least on the endgame version. I don't run this lost on the earlier versions, but just do please keep that in mind. I do put my resistances in here. That being said, I always count suffixes on my build. Like, I know I have 9 open suffixes on this build, so it's possible to res cap. And I always count suffixes, and I make sure I have more suffixes open earlier game. So you'll never have issues with, like, I don't have enough item slots to rise cap. That is something that I will be on top of. Anyway, let's get into the build. So, what makes Ignite Slams do damage? Now, one thing about Slams and Ignite that I find really interesting is typically the drawback of Ignite is that it's quite ZDPS, and typically I find the drawback of Slams to be the clear is good, but it's not super good. And I think these two sort of archetypes go hand in hand really, really well together, because they kind of solve each other's problems, where Ignites solve Slam's lack of clear, and it's not really a lack of clear, but it's not like S tier clear, right? And Ignite solve that with prolifts, and then you eventually get explodes that prolift more ignites, and then it just goes all over the screen and it goes crazy. As well as for Slams themselves, they do a ton of damage, so they solve the ZDPS aspect of Ignite, which is also a super big deal. So that's why I'm running Ignite Slams. Now the question is, why do Slams do so much damage? So the few vectors for this, the first one would be Fist of War. So Fist of War is a support gem that can only support Slam skills, and this lets them be ancestrally boosted every few seconds. And said ancestrally boosted Slam has a huge more multi. As you can see right there on a 2020 gem, it has 98% more damage with hits and ailments, which is a huge damage multiplier. And for the purposes of this build, it is free because our ignites last a very long time, and we refresh our ignites thanks to defiled forces in early game, and in late game we just have way more slams. It is just super, super comfy. Basically just carries our damage on ignites. You just ancestrally boost a slam and it just has a huge ignite, and as long as you can carry your ignites, you're good, which in this case I have more ignite duration than I have the requirement for Fist of War, so you'll always have good ignites up. The second thing is exerting an attack. So the way Warcries work, if you're not familiar with them, is if you Warcry, there's two components of a Warcry. There's a buff component, and then there's also an exertion component. So auto exertion is something that automates your Warcries. That disables the buff components of all Warcries it's triggering. So for my Seismic Cry and my Battle Mage's Cry, you can basically ignore the buff lines. The thing that's important here is the line that says, exerts the next 5 melee attacks you perform. Exerted attacks trigger a supported spell with their first melee hit. So in the case of Battle Mage's Cry, it lets us automate flammability, because all my slams are going to be exerted, and then therefore they will always trigger flammability. In the same manner, Seismic Cry right there says exerts the next 6 melee attacks you perform. Exerted attacks have 50% more AoE. So that's how we sort of get to all of these crazy AoE numbers like a 10-meter radius. Additionally, the last cry that I'm running on the build is Rallying Cry. This is the only one that I'm self-casting, as you would have seen in the showcase section. And the point of Rallying Cry here is it gives you a buff, or it gives nearby allies a buff. Based on how many of the nearby allies there are, you get Warcry power. So because we're an Elementalist and we have golems, we always have 4 golems, which means we always have 20 power on Rallying Cry. And the exertion component of Rallying Cry depends on how many allies you buff. So the buff itself doesn't matter. All we care about is the fact that we are buffing our golems. Because if we're buffing our golems, we get the exertion bonus for our attack, which is 5% more damage per affected ally, up to a maximum of 25. We don't get the whole 25% bonus because I only have 4 golems. We do get 20% more damage for just pressing this button, which is super, super nice. Now, the final place where all of this comes together is overexertion support. Overexertion support then gives you 18% more damage for every single Warcry exerting your attack. And on single target, we always have 3. While clearing, we always have 2. So that means while clearing, this is effectively a 46% more damage gem. And while on single target, this ends up being about I think it's 64% more damage gem, which is completely insane. Like this gem, again, a huge reason that our damage gets super carried. Additionally, there is also in the end game for exerted attacks, you have the option to go Echoes of Creation. I figured I'd talk about this because I have this in the end game PoE. And this gives you another 15% more damage for every single Warcry exerting an attack. So in this case, we'd get 45% more damage. But the downside is when you attack, you take 15% of your life as physical damage for every Warcry that exerts an attack. Now, as it stands, that would currently be about 2,400 or 2,500 flat physical damage that we're taking every time we slam. However, because we scale armor so heavily, that gets brought down very significantly, all the way down to about like 200, 250 flat damage that we take every time we slam, which is a pretty big deal. Because what that means is, A, we're not taking that much damage because we have good recovery in endgame, but B, that also lets us automate some skills, such as Flame Surge with a cost when damage taken support at level 1, because Flame Surge doesn't gain more damage for an Ignite build based on gem levels. You can leave this at level 1 with a level 1 cost when damage taken, and this cost when damage taken procs very, very often. As you can see, it only requires 528 damage, and with the quality, it only requires around 470. So every 2 slams, we're going to proc cost when damage taken, which will then proc Flame Surge, completely automating this as well, alongside the curse. So that those 2 things just make the build super, super comfy to play. Now, other additional bonuses of slams and other additional things that are good about slams is that they do hit really hard. As you can see on this version, I have 471,000 as my hit. And if I go even to the red map setup, we're at 100,000 on our hit, which is pretty damn good. So what that lets us do is, A, it lets us run Cruelty support, which is really, really big. Cruelty support gives you a lot of extra damage on your skill. It gives you dot damage. And then we can also run Fortify, because Cruelty also gives us more damage with hits. It also enables us to use Fortify much easier. If you go back to the gameplay showcase, you'll notice I'm at max Fortified pretty much the entire map, which is a huge deal in terms of considering defenses. As you can probably see, if I untick Fortified, yeah, pretty big deal. Now, in terms of the way that I'm doing defenses for the endgame version, I have opted to go for Maxres, because I think it's very, very strong, and it's good to get your elemental pool up, especially because considering we get 40% of physical damage taken as fire as long as the enemy is ignited. And so Maxres scaling ends up being very, very good defensively. And the other thing that I'm scaling is armor. There's 2 reasons for this. One is because I want to run Echoes of Creation. It's just a huge more damage multiplier. And the second reason that I really, really like to run armor is it's just a nice defensive layer against physical damage, which otherwise you can somewhat struggle against. And if you go for full armor bases, you also have access to the armor mastery, which is +1 all maximum resistances if your Helmet, body armor, gloves, and boots all have armor, which in our case we do. So both things again kind of just go hand in hand, and it just kind of works out really, really well. Another defensive consideration you can make slightly earlier, if we go back to the red map setup, is you can consider, at least for next league, to drop Malevolence and go Purity of Elements. Now, this will be a significant damage loss. It's about 25% less damage, as you can see here. It's a pretty decent chunk of damage lost. However, I do think the build has enough damage that this is fine to do. And in exchange, you would run Purity of Elements, and I think that's a really good way of solving ailments. The reason that I bring this up is that I do think breaches are going to have very brutal ailment application, especially when it comes to stuff like Esh breaches. Esh breaches are currently, at least as far as I can tell, very notorious for applying massive shocks. And if you catch yourself dying inside breaches, I will almost assure you that it's probably a massive shock. Either that or it's bleed, which I would recommend getting immunity to on a flask, on your life flask. But if it's not bleed, I'm almost certain it'll probably be a shock. So definitely a defensive consideration for next league. Swap the Purity of Elements instead of running Malevolence. One last thing that I would like to talk about, armor, before I forget and we go on to the leveling section, is I would also like to mention a really big reason for going armor is that armor enables you to use Molten Shell. Now, I currently have this disabled in the PoE because I don't want to, people like turning off guard skill, so I'm just going to adhere to that. But Molten Shell is one very strong guard skill for armor, and I personally think the reason a lot of people think armor is weak is because in PoE you don't see the power of Molten Shell because people have gotten used to not taking guard skills, and I can assure you Molten Shell is a very strong guard skill, and you're definitely going to feel it when you put on a Molten Shell with 35k armor. It makes you very tanky. And if you're doing bosses or whatever on this endgame setup, then maybe you could even consider taking out the cost 1 damage taken and just self-casting the Molten Shell when you know you're going to end up into some sort of one-shot boss mechanic or something that's just going to hit you for a ton of damage. If you self-cast your Molten Shell, it's going to take way less damage. It's a very strong guard skill. Now that we're through all of that, we've kind of gone through the offensive scaling and the defensive scaling. The last thing I would like to talk about is our ascendancy of choice, which is Elementalist. One of the reasons that I wanted to go Elementalist is golems. Golems provide huge amounts of buffs, mostly just a ton of QOL and problem solving, and they're super nice damage-wise as well. And we are running a absolute ton of golem effect on the tree. We have 3 primordial bonds on our clusters. And on top of that, we are also anointing Golem Commander for the +1 Golem as well as the 40% effect here, plus the 50% effect from Liege of the Primordial, which I have accounted for on this POB. And so altogether, we run Chaos Golem. This gives us a ton of dot multi as well as Chaos Resistance. This makes capping our Chaos Res much easier. Gives us about 60% Chaos Res, slightly less. We run Flame Golem. Flame Golem is a huge source of AoE. As you guys can see, I have a 10 meter radius AoE. If I untick Flame Golem, it drops all the way down to 8.7. So very strong there. And is another reason why I wanted to do Elementalist, is just this ease of access to area of effect. We are also running Lightning Golem. Now, the mana regen on Lightning Golem is obviously really big and super strong. However, the thing that I really want to draw attention to here is the attack and cost speed is completely massive. Typically, you would think it's an Ignite build. You don't really want to scale attack and cost speed, so the stat's kind of wasted. But in all honesty, when you play the game, if you're going to play a build that doesn't have attack speed or doesn't have cost speed, it feels really bad to play. And Lightning Golem makes the build feel a lot better to play just because it gives you that much attack speed. On top of that, when you pick it up in campaign, it makes shield charging way faster, which makes your campaign a lot faster. It's just probably the strongest golem, and probably my favorite golem is Lightning Golem. So yeah, just not much else to say there. Finally, we run Stone Golem. Stone Golem just gives us more armor as well as giving us a ton of life regen. As you can see, I'm at 500 life regen. If I turn off Stone Golem, it goes all the way down to 162. So pretty big deal. Definitely make sure that you're running Stone Golem. Super strong. Now, with the golems out of the way, the other reasons that I picked Elementalist are specifically Shaper of Storms and Masterminded Discord. Shaper of Flames is really nice, don't get me wrong. Like, you do get, being able to have all damage can ignite is super nice for being able to pick up a tri-ele weapon instead of a fizz weapon. Makes your weapon a bit cheaper as well. It lets you run a nice prismatic tincture instead of the ignite tincture, as well as allowing you to run Oriat's End in endgame, letting you benefit from all three types of explosions to apply ignites, which is super big for clear. However, despite that, I actually really like Shaper of Storms as well as Masterminded Discord. Now, if you've seen Next League, you would have seen, or if you've seen the trailers for Next League or some of the content going around by people like Ziggy, you would have seen that some of the grafts for Next League are very, very strong. One of them in name is does give you covered in ash, so there is an angle to drop Polaric Devastation. However, another thing I noticed is that grafts just do a lot of damage. So there is potential to maybe find some really OP single target graft, and because Shaper of Storms applies a shock, that's increased damage taken on the enemy. That is a multiplier that would apply to your graft. As well as minus resistances from Masterminded Discord is also technically minus resistances on the mob. So that is also something that should apply to your graft. So these are just a couple of things that will help your graft damage. Mostly just because I think grafts are going to be completely broken and probably one-shot stuff. So might as well lean into it a little bit as well and have sort of this debuff playstyle where you debuff the enemies. And I think that's going to pay off quite significantly. Now that all of that's done, I would like to talk about the leveling process. We're going to go through sort of all the leveling POBs. Now, Act 1 is fairly straightforward. You're basically going to start rolling magma and cast Holy Flame Totem. Holy Flame Totem is going to be the bulk of your damage. At this stage, I found that for most of my clearing during Act 1, I would just place Holy Flame Totem and then buff it with a Flame Wall. And the Holy Flame Totem projectiles are just going to get a ton of damage as they pass through the Flame Wall, and they will basically just one-shot packs, which is super, super nice in Act 1. Eventually, once you get to Act 2, and you finish the Fidelitas quest on the right side of the encampment, inside the Chamber of Sins, you will want to pick up RF. Now, one thing I do want you to keep in mind is to make sure that you get this Fire Mastery for regen 1 life per second per 1% uncapped fire res, and make sure that your fire res is overcapped enough so that you're not losing HP per second with Righteous Fire up. Outside of that, we run Scorching Ray as well. We pick up Scorching Ray back from the Act 1 vendor, and this will apply a massive fire exposure debuff, which will increase our RF damage significantly. And we also run Infused Channeling in here just to give us a decently chunky size of less damage taken from hits. And at this point, you can also start using Shield Charge for your mobility because you probably have the sockets for it if you didn't already in Act 1. Moving on to Act 3, the setup is basically the same. The only change here is that we do also run Malevolence here. We pick up Malevolence, and again, like I said earlier, you could also consider going Purity of Elements. Both are fine. Purity of Elements, of course, being a little bit extra strong with RF just because it will give you a little more regen as well. And at this point, you will also go do the Siosa quest inside the library just to pick up faster attacks and momentum to make sure that your shield charge is nice and quick. And so leveling at this point will basically continue. You pick up your golems inside Act 4. In this order of priority, I made sure to put them in the order. So let's say you only have 2 blue sockets, you would get Lightning and Chaos Golem, obviously. But if you only have 1 blue socket, then prioritize the Lightning Golem over the Chaos Golem. So I've put these in order of priority. You get these Golem gems after Vol in Act 4. You'll need 3 Chance Orbs, and you can pick up 1 from the quest. So just make sure you have Chance Orbs. And if you don't have Chance Orbs, you might have Fusings in your stash. You can convert Fusings to Chances at the vendor, so make sure you do that. This setup should carry you all the way to Act 7. And after you finish Act 7, you're going to go do Second Lab. And once you do Second Lab, you're going to swap to your Ignite Slam setup. Now, I am aware that you might not necessarily have Grand Slam of Earth Shaking here, which I currently have in a 4-link. You might not have this skill immediately. This should be relatively cheap on League Start, but just in case it isn't, I have also put in an alternate Earthquake setup for you to be able to run Earthquake. When I did my leveling run, I played Earthquake all the way until Act 10. which is when I ended up migrating and then buying a ground slam. So make sure that you do run Earthquake. If you cannot get ground slam of earth shaking, it is just better than any other slam skill for the purposes of this build. And also make sure that you link less duration and swift affliction to it. Reason for this being, both of these give less duration, which reduces the amount of time before the second aftershock, or before the aftershock of the earthquake goes off. So it'll make your clearing on the skill much more comfy. The downside of being earthquake, of course, being because you have to commit 2 support gems to it, you have slightly less damage and you can't run ignite prolif, which does help quite a bit. Now, aside from that, all you're really going to want is a weapon with a decent amount of flat damage at this point. I would recommend saving up your gold from about Act 5 to Act 6 onwards. Just save your gold and then spend it all on weapons or some item slots in case you need gem colors, because there's quite a few gem colors changing when you're getting your Warcries in. So I would highly recommend just saving up your gold after about Act 4, Act 5, all the way until Act 7, and then once you're in Act 7, you can gamble for a decent axe. It doesn't need to be anything exceptional, and just some armor gear so that you can fit in some of your other gems. From here, it's about the same all the way until Act 10, and then finally we get into white maps. Now, for as far as your white maps gear is concerned, almost all of your gear is just going to be rare gear. As long as it has life and resistances, that's all you really care about. The really special thing here that you want to get is a Debeon's Dirge. This is a tier 5 unique. It's going to be super cheap and it costs 1 chaos usually. If it ends up being more expensive, you could craft a really cheap axe for just 2 essences or something. But I do like this axe just because it's convenient and it's cheap and it's easy. So you can definitely run this for your entire white map progression. Not much else to say there. Moving into yellow maps. Yellow maps is where we will finally switch off the Debeon's Dirge and make an axe. Now, this is a very conservative axe. You'll find that it's actually very easy to beat this axe in terms of DPS. The main benefit here is making sure that it's on a Despo axe base with an attack speed roll. This will make your slams feel infinitely better than running a Debeon's Dirge, so just make sure that you get these 2 things. I don't care if you lose 20% damage doing it. I think it's 100% worth it, and the likelihood is you probably won't lose 20% damage switching to a rare axe. You'll probably gain damage at this point. So do make sure that you make that swap over once you get the yellow maps. The faster slams also make for a faster gameplay experience, but also they will help your survivability because you won't be sitting there in an animation standing still for like 2 seconds. Other than that, we also run Dyadian Dawn. Now, this isn't necessarily the best if you have a large amount of phase damage in your axe relative to the amount of elemental damage you have on your axe. As you can see, if I drop this, I only lose about 7% damage. But the benefit of this is that it makes your ignites deal damage faster, which will make them take down faster. This lowers your ignite duration, of course, but it does give you a decent amount of damage. It's not the most on this setup. It is a lot more on the red maps and the endgame setup, of course, because then my damage becomes much more elemental skewed. Also, a little bit of a side benefit. The fact that it says deals no physical damage, technically a downside because we do lose ignite damage. However, it's not the worst because it also makes you Fizz Reflect immune, which for actually going through your Atlas progression is super nice because that's just one more map mod that you can run, which is, I mean, I'm never complaining about that. Finally, we can talk about the red map setup. Here, you would craft a relatively decent axe. This one, I just yoinked from my character in-game. This took me about 8 essences to roll, I would say, and it shouldn't be very hard to craft a similar axe. You literally just roll essences. You could probably also pick up a nice corrupted base, or you could maybe even pick up a fractured base. But I can assure you there's probably going to be a bunch of these axes on trade, so I'd definitely look for them first before trying to craft them. If there are none, then you can maybe try to craft a decent one. Just, again, make sure it's on a Despo axe base with decent attack speed. Outside of that, I've just put some basic Eldritch implicits on the items. The most important of these is the gloves, just to get that exposure in so that when you're hitting red maps and getting your 4th lab, you can enable that with your glove exposure. And you can also pick up Ignite Prolif here and replace the Ignite Prolif gem inside your links with added lightning damage. Outside of that, implicits, very, very simple. We're basically just doing some damage implicits. The helmet gets a little bit of reduced mana cost and phase taken as, and that's about it. And of course, still aiming for the largest amount of life. And at this point, you want to maybe start grabbing a little bit of armor, specifically with the body armor. Make sure it's a full armor body armor without life modifiers, because we do pick up the life mastery. If you do end up getting life modifiers on your body armor, then make sure you drop this knob, because it'll just be a wasted point. As for jewels, just very basic life dot multi jewels. Going into endgame, which is the final setup that I have prepped. Most of the stuff stays the same. Echoes of Creation, with most of the stuff stays the same, but it's just higher tiers. The one thing that I would like to draw attention to on the rare items is the Warcries cannot exert travel skills. We get this on the Ami. This basically just allows you to switch this mastery over to Warcries have a minimum 10 power. The reason that's very strong is because then we can run mob mentality clusters, which will give us endurance and frenzy charges, which is super nice. We will also run lead by example on one of these medium clusters, which is permanent onslaught. And finally, we will also have warning goal, which is a ton of armor. It's about 9k armor on this setup, which is also super, super nice. In terms of gearing, Polaric Devastation next league, as I said earlier, will maybe be droppable based on Grafts, because we have seen a Graft which has cover enemies and Ash, which would obviously be really nice. Other than that, again, it's just rare gear with slightly better stats and including some damage stats. In terms of clusters, we are stacking just a bunch of golem effect, like I mentioned earlier in the golem section. There's not much else to it. And then finally, we have our rare jewels, which is just the same life fire dot multi, but with an extra affix. On some of these, I have attack speed. On others, I have maximum resistance. This is just basically so that you can round out your Maxres up to 85, which I think should be a relatively tanky build at that point. Anyway, that's about it for the video. I just wanted to go over everything. This is going to be my starter. I'm super excited to run this. And if you guys have any questions, be sure to drop by my Twitch, because I will be streaming on League Start at twitch.tv/void341. So please do come and hang out. And if you're playing this build, I hope you have an amazing time. I know I have been having an absolute blast testing this build. So I reckon League Start is going to be a banger of a time. Anyway, thank you guys for watching. And I'll keep you updated on the build. I'll probably post a couple of videos after League Start as well, with like a day 2, day 3 update or whatever. And yeah, thank you guys for watching. I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye.